Welcome back to another episode of Unseen Yet Unstoppable. All right, let's get into it. We're about to break down one of the most raw, passionate, and honestly influential letters ever written. And I'm not kidding. This is not some calm, boring theological paper. It's a furious letter written right in the middle of a crisis that was about to tear a brand new movement completely apart. I mean, just look at this opening line. The author, the Apostle Paul, wastes absolutely zero time. There's no, hello, how are you? He just jumps in with pure, unfiltered shock. You can almost feel the sense of betrayal just radiating off the page. He's not just disappointed. He is, as he says, completely astonished. So what in the world could make someone react like this? I mean, what could possibly throw an entire community into chaos and provoke such an intense response? That right there, that's the central question of this whole letter. It's kind of like we've just walked onto a crime scene. In Paul's letter, that's our main piece of evidence. So let's follow his arguments and see if we can figure out what went so terribly wrong in Galatia. Okay, so let's start digging. Paul's first move is to define the problem, to name the crime, so to speak. And believe me, he's not talking about some minor disagreement here. He thinks the entire foundation of his message is under attack. So at the heart of this whole mess is what he calls a different gospel. But notice his language. He immediately says it's not a gospel at all. He's convinced that these unnamed agitators, these troublemakers, have taken his core message of freedom and completely twisted it. They're confusing everyone by piling on a bunch of new rules and requirements that were never a part of the original deal. But before Paul can even start defending his message, he has to defend himself. See, these agitators were clearly going after his credibility. So he dedicates a huge part of this letter to answering a really basic question. Paul, why should we even listen to you? And this is his key claim, his big defense. He argues that his gospel, the message he preaches, wasn't taught to him by other people, not even the other apostles. He says he got it directly from a revelation of Jesus Christ himself. This is a huge deal. He's saying his authority isn't secondhand. It came straight from the top. And this timeline he lays out really backs up his point. Think about it. Right after his conversion, he doesn't run off to Jerusalem to get instructions from headquarters. Nope. He goes off the grid to Arabia, then starts preaching in Damascus. It's a full 3 years before he even has a brief meeting with Peter, and then another 14 years go by before he goes back to formally check in with the leaders. He's building a really strong case here that he was never just some delivery boy for the Jerusalem church. And here's the kicker. When he finally does sit down with the so-called pillars of the church, you know, Peter, James, and John, they don't correct him. They don't say, hey, you've got it all wrong. They actually added nothing to his message. In fact, they endorsed what he was doing, giving him the green light for his mission to the non-Jews. So in Paul's mind, his authority is now case closed. Okay? So now that he's established his credentials, Paul finally gets to the real heart of the problem. This is it. The core conflict, the theological firestorm that's causing all this chaos in Galatia. Now, before we get any deeper, we really need to get our heads around this one key term, justification. It sounds kind of technical, but the idea behind it is pretty simple. It's just about how a person gets made right with God. The troublemakers in Galatia are saying you do it by following the Jewish law, especially circumcision. Paul is about to argue that they are not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. So Paul basically presents two completely different paths. On one side, you've got the path of the law. This requires you to perfectly follow all the rules like circumcision. But Paul says nobody can actually do that. So it ultimately leads to what he calls a curse. Then on the other side, you have the path of faith. This one's not about doing a bunch of stuff. It's about trusting a promise. And according to Paul, that's the path that leads to receiving the Spirit and having a real connection with God. And then Paul pulls out his Exhibit A, his mic drop moment. He goes way, way back in history, hundreds of years before the law was even a thing. And he brings up Abraham, the father of the whole faith, and he asks, how was Abraham made right with God? Well, it wasn't through observing laws. It was because he believed God. For Paul, this is case closed proof that faith has always been the way. Now, Paul wants to make it crystal clear. This isn't just some abstract theological debate for him. To prove it, he tells a story, and it's a juicy one. It's about a dramatic public showdown that shows just how high the stakes really are. Yeah, this isn't just some vague story about those agitators anymore. He's about to name names. He puts one of the most famous and respected leaders, the Apostle Peter himself, right in the spotlight to make his case. You can't really get higher stakes than that. Okay, so here's how it all went down. They're in the city of Antioch, and at first everything's great. Peter is totally on board with Paul's gospel. He's eating with non-Jewish followers, ignoring all the old dietary laws, breaking down those walls. But then a conservative group shows up from Jerusalem, and suddenly Peter gets nervous. He caves to peer pressure, pulls back from the non-Jews, and basically starts acting like a total hypocrite, treating them like second-class citizens. And Paul, seeing this, doesn't just let it slide. No way. He says he opposed him to his face in front of everybody. He calls out Peter, a pillar of the church, for being a hypocrite and for abandoning the truth of the gospel. For Paul, this story is the ultimate proof that this issue is absolutely non-negotiable. He'll take on anyone to defend it. So after establishing his authority and laying out the core problem, and even telling that intense story about Peter, Paul makes a pivot. He shifts from telling them what not to do to explaining what this freedom he's so passionate about actually looks like in real life. And this verse is pretty much the rallying cry for the whole letter. Paul is making it so clear his message isn't about trading one set of rules for another. It's about real, genuine freedom. He sees what these other guys are teaching as a yoke of slavery. And it's like they're trying to drag people who've been set free right back into chains. And this is a really important, but this freedom isn't a free-for-all. Paul is very clear that it's not a license to just go wild and do whatever you feel like. Instead, he says it presents a choice between two different ways of living. You can either live by what he calls the sinful nature, which leads to stuff like hatred and jealousy, or you can live by the Spirit, which naturally produces things like love, joy, and patience. And if you had any doubt just how passionate and, let's be honest, furious Paul is about all this, he drops one of the most shocking lines in all his writings. He basically says that since these guys are so obsessed with circumcision, he wishes they would just go the whole way and emasculate themselves. I mean, wow. It's a brutal, raw comment that just shows you the depth of his frustration. And yet, out of all that fire and fury comes this absolutely breathtaking vision. This is the climax of his whole argument. He says that in this new community, the most basic divisions of the ancient world, Jew or Greek, slave or free, even male or female, they just don't matter anymore. They're all one. It's a truly radical idea. And that's really the enduring legacy of this short, angry letter. What was written in the heat of the moment during a crisis ended up becoming this foundational text for a whole new way of thinking about community. It makes the case that what really unites people isn't a shared culture or heritage, but a shared faith. And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative question, one that still echoes today. So in conclusion, Paul's argument for freedom was absolutely revolutionary, but it also raises a challenge, right? If the core message is freedom from old rules and divisions, how do communities figure out which rules to keep and which to let go of? How do you build a healthy society? Where do you draw the lines? That's the powerful ongoing debate that was sparked by Paul's fury all those years ago in his letter to the Galatians. Before we sign off, I definitely want to give a shout out and thank all the listeners for stopping by to check out another episode, whether you're in the gym, in your car, or just being intentional with taking time out to get a better understanding of the word. Please like, subscribe, and put on your notifications, and we'll catch you next time with another deep dive. Peace.